Okay, hello and welcome. I think we should be up and running now. So welcome to the 2023 RAC Magazine F-Gas Question Time. For those who don't know me, I'm now RAC editor Neil Merritt, and I'm proud to be something of a host for the latest in our ongoing look at all things F-Gas, both in the UK and in the EU, of course, perhaps most significantly. We're delighted to be hosting the event once again with our sponsors, Chemours. You'll be hearing from the company later in the event, particularly as we're going to talk about some of the technical and policy challenges. Certainly, I think this year, as an event, there's going to be plenty for us to talk about. We have the planned reforms of the regulation in the EU, as well as the separate review and reforms that could be taking place in the UK. And actually see the UK diverge perhaps significantly or less so from our neighbours in the EU as well. So with some of these topics as likely talking points, we are delighted, of course, and somewhat reliant on getting questions from our audience today. So that's an opportunity in the various panels we've got to put the questions to us. So there's a Q&A section, should be at the bottom of your screens there that you can click on, and that will allow us to make sure we're getting those questions through and make sure I can put them to the panels. We've got our first panel this morning that will be looking at more of the policy side, and then we're delighted also to have some experts joining us to talk about the technical side as well. So there's plenty up to 12 to keep us going. But if you can, please try to make sure that the questions for our different panels are put in that Q&A section and not so much in the chat, as you risk not having them seen. But anyway, I think there's so much to discuss. It's probably a good time for me to shut up and we get started with a roundup of where we find ourselves right now. So I'm delighted to say we're joined by Ray Gluckman of Gluckman Consulting. And he is going to start by helping us sort of set the scene of what's happening with the regulations, which is hopefully a good place to start. Ray, if I could ask you to come in, and I will leave to you and catch up with you in a bit.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil, and good morning to everybody. Let me just put my slides on the screen. For a second, there we go. Neil, could you just confirm that that's up on the screen?
That's up, Ray, we can see that. Yeah, we got the F-gas update there.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much, Neil, for inviting me to do this introductory talk. It's it does feel like Groundhog Day. Been here a few times over many years of RAC F-gas question times, but things are really hotting up a little bit. This is an interesting, if somewhat scary year. So my subtitle there, the year for a new EU regulation and PFAS controls, is sort of what I'm going to try to cover in part of my introduction. So I'll give a quick review on the current F-gas regulation, talk about the status of negotiations in Europe, talk about what's happening with PFAS in Europe. I've got one slide about the UK process, just for completeness in my talk, but really that's being covered in a minute by Graham in much more detail. So what's going on with the current regulation? As probably you all know, after Brexit, we simply copied the old EU F-gas regulation into British law. So the regulations are the same in Europe and in the UK. We're at the stage in terms of the HFC phase down of a 55% cut from the baseline, which is pretty impressive performance from Europe and the UK. As I think I said last year, we don't seem to have noticed a sort of refrigerant shortage because of this level of cut. So that's encouraging. It shows things are moving on. And we are way ahead of what is required for other developed countries under Kigali, where at the moment they're just at 10% cut, and they don't get to a 55% cut till I think it's something like 2029. So we're setting the pathway. Since we last spoke at one of these events, the foams ban kicked in at the beginning of 2023. That was the only new ban. And what that means is all types of foams that were historically blown with, well, originally with CFCs and HCFCs, and more recently with high GWP HFCs, that's all stopped now. So there's this GWP threshold of 150. Some of the foam sector has moved to hydrocarbon type blowing agents, but there's also quite a lot of HFO blowing agents that have got very good performance that are being used in the foam sector. In the RAC HP market generally, of course, we're seeing ongoing introduction of new equipment with lower GWP refrigerants, lots more products available, and the reclaim and recycle markets are continuing to develop because, of course, reclaimed refrigerant is outside of the quota system. So we now have a good monetary value on secondhand refrigerant, and thankfully a lot of it is being recaptured. Obviously, it's been mandatory to recover refrigerant, HFC refrigerant, since the 2006 regulation. So that requirement has been in place a long time. But until the phase down really kicked in, I don't think we saw much of a viable market for reclaimed gas, but that is no longer the case. Under the current regulation, what else is there left? Actually, not a lot, really. There's an important cut in quota in January is the next phase down step. So we're at 55% cut at the moment. We've got the last really big cut under the current regulation, I stress, that will kick in January. So that's where I say they're equivalent to 72%, including PCE. That means pre-charged equipment that is imported into Europe, and it makes the target slightly more challenging than the headline value of 69%. Whichever way you look at it, it's actually a great progress from where we were 9 or 10 years ago. There's one more product ban in the current regulation, which is single split air conditioners that contain less than 3 kilograms of refrigerant. And that has a GWP limit of 750. It doesn't kick in for another year and a half, beginning of 2025, but effectively it's already in place because almost all of the market for small split air conditioning has moved on from 410A either to HFC 32 or to blends like 454B, for example, that contain a lot of 32. And kind of that's almost the end of the story for the current regulation, because there'll be some more cuts in quota, and we end up at a 79% cut in 2030 under the current regulation. But there's no other new controls that will be introduced. But of course, there's another big story behind all that. That the current regulation will get updated, and I'll go through that in a minute. Just one slide about Kigali. So obviously back in 2016, the global community signed up to an HFC phase down. We've now got 147 countries have ratified Kigali, which is 75% of all the countries in the world. All 197, by the way, have ratified other bits of the Montreal Protocol. They're all phasing out R22, for example. But we're well on the way to having complete ratification. The three biggest economies or countries in terms of population have all ratified. And because the very big countries have ratified, actually about 84% of the global population is in ratified countries. Just out of interest, if these three countries here, Pakistan, Egypt, and the Congo, if they did ratify, that notches it up towards 90% of the global population. So I'm sure efforts are being made to get these last countries to ratify. As I've already said, the EU and the UK are well ahead of any Kigali phase down targets. It wouldn't be until the mid-2030s when the current EU and UK regulation kind of might slip a little way behind the final Kigali phase down target of 85%. We've only got a 79% cut in the current regulation, albeit with a slightly different baseline. In the developing world, there's an enormous amount going on, and quite a few countries are sort of trying to leapfrog the high GWP technologies. I guess that's particularly visible in things like small air conditioning, where R32 is being widely used in lots of developing countries in place of 410A. But the journey to get rid of R22 is not yet complete in developing countries. They've got another 6 or 7 years before they're fully phased out. And unfortunately, there's even a few people stupid enough to be buying brand new R22 equipment, which does seem a bit crazy. Okay, now moving on to the EU process. First of all, why does this matter to a UK-based audience? Mainly because whatever happens in Europe will influence the technologies that we're able to purchase, given that we import so much of our equipment in the RAC HP sector. So it's very important that we understand what's going on in Europe, even though the UK might have regulations that are different to the EU. There was a sort of technical review of the regulation done a couple of years ago. Then, almost exactly a year ago, the European Commission published their formal proposal. We discussed it at last year's question time. It's very ambitious, which is not surprising given the EU climate change policies. What's happened more recently is that the Parliament, through the Envy Committee, have kind of done a deep dive into the proposal and come up with their counter proposal, if you want to call it that. And there was a vote in the full European Parliament in March that agreed a parliamentary position, which is more ambitious than the Commission proposal. And a key point in there is that various bands which are in the Commission proposal with a GWP threshold of 150 have been changed to the bans being a ban on all fluorocarbons. So that effectively bans HFOs as well as HFCs. That's just in their position. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but that's what they've put forward. The third important document that was agreed in April is what's called the EU Council position. So that's all the member states representatives under the current chairmanship of the presidency, which is Sweden. They again do a deep dive into the Commission proposal, and they make a kind of counter positional proposal. And actually, the Council position, I mean, it tidies up various things that are a bit loose in the Commission proposal, but it's got a lot of similarities to the Commission proposal. It isn't sort of significantly less ambitious than the Commission proposal. So what happens now, they've just started what are called the trilogue negotiations. So that is discussions between the EU Council, the Parliament and the European Commission, and they have a number of meetings and they thrash through these three different positions and try to come up with the final compromise. Much, no doubt, horse trading goes on, and we'll swap this one for that one if you agree, and blah blah blah. It's I don't think it's a terribly transparent process, but that is taking place. And when they reach a conclusion, there will be a regulation that can go forward. The earliest possible time for that would be sometime during the summer. I mean, interestingly, the presidency of the EU changes every 6 months, and it will switch in at the end of June from Sweden to, I think it's Spain. I think the Swedish presidency would like to get this wrapped up during their presidency. And I think Spain would prefer that as well. So it might mean that by the end of June, there is an agreement. That would be remarkably quick, mind you, but it's possible that that will happen. If that does happen, then the new regulation could easily start on the 1st of January next year. If they miss that deadline and it goes, 3 or 4 months further into the autumn, for various technical reasons like translating the regulation into lots of different languages, that whole process takes quite a while, and presumably the 1st of January start date would have to be put back if that happens. The UK review process, as I said, I'm not going to say much about it, but other than that there's an independent review being carried out by DEFRA into the situation in the UK. They've recognised that there's some quite important differences between the UK market and the overall EU market. So it's possible that there will be different rules. But of course, for the industry, there's benefits in harmonisation. And in any case, the UK also has very ambitious climate change targets. So yeah, I can imagine that we'll have a subtly different regulation. But I won't say any more than that, really. The timetable is somewhat slower. So our new regulation won't kick in until maybe a year later than the EU regulation. Let's just talk in a bit more detail about a couple of aspects of what's on the table in Brussels at the moment. So first of all, the phase down. Clearly, that is a key element of the current regulation. It's ultimately the thing that drives the environmental benefits. The bans and things like that are helpful signposts as to which sectors should go first. But at the end of the day, it's the phase down quotas that define the environmental effectiveness of the regulation. The Commission proposal includes significantly deeper cuts right from the get-go in 2024, and also new cuts after 2030, which we don't have in the current regulation. The Parliament position is not dissimilar up through the 2030s, but it goes even deeper after the 2030s with zero proposed for 2050, zero quota for HFCs. And the council position gives a bit more quota in these early years, and then it's exactly the same as the Commission in terms of the phase down. So what does that sort of look like? This yellow line is the existing phase down profile. We had a baseline set back in 2009 to 2012, average consumption of HFCs measured in tons of CO2 equivalent. We're currently at this 55% cut that started 2 years ago. In January, we're going to be down to 69%. And then there's a couple more rather smaller steps until we get to the final cut of 79% in the current regulation. The Commission proposal is the darker line, and you can see it is significantly tougher. So bearing in mind that the yellow line there is 79%, by 2027, they're already suggesting a 90% cut. And by 2030, it's a 95% cut. It is a very ambitious profile in those early years. And then there's some more modest cuts, and it gets down. So instead of zero in their proposal, they've got 2.5% left at the end. What are the issues there? Well, have they done their sums right? Will there be sufficient HFCs available for servicing the existing stock of equipment and to install the growing stock of equipment in Europe? And of course, a key issue is heat pumps. Policy related to climate change, obviously, is that we have to decarbonize fossil fuel heating. And for residential and commercial building heating, and also for low temperature industrial heating, heat pumps are the logical thing to go for. So we will see a massive growth in the number of heat pumps in Europe. And of course, the question is, what refrigerants are they going to use? Obviously, the Ukraine situation makes that even more urgent and the European Council put a paper out last year called Repower EU that pushes for an even faster introduction of heat pumps in the next few years so that they're not so reliant on natural gas. I've been involved in quite a bit of modelling work, and my modelling of the EU market indicates that the proposed phase down is going to be incredibly challenging up to around the early 2030s. After that, technology will have caught up, and I can envisage the sort of ambition that the Commission have proposed, but I'm quite concerned about the first 8 to 10 years. As I mentioned, there are bans in the proposal as well, and the bans are really there to signpost to industry actions they've got to take that will in turn lead to those to the phase down that's required. And I haven't put all the bans on this slide, but I put the most important and controversial ones. And I mean, part of the problem with the way that the Commission have proposed these bans is that they haven't defined things very well. They've introduced phrases like self-contained and plug-in equipment, and we can all imagine what we think those words mean, but they haven't got a definition for them. And that's caused a lot of heartache around the industry in the last 12 months. Unfortunately, I mean, I think the Commission realised they should have put a proper definition in their first draft, but because it's a formal draft, they're not allowed to edit it until this trilogue process takes place. So for the last 12 months, we've been left in this sort of grey area. What does self-contained mean? And I think one of the slightly unforeseen circumstances is that self-contained certainly could mean quite large equipment like factory-built chillers, which everything is constructed in the factory, filled with refrigerant, and so that when that device is delivered to site, there's no refrigerant handling needed. And that is likely to be in the wider or broad definition of self-contained. So when it's, again, this word plug-in, we assume means plugs into a 13 amp socket, as opposed to being wired into a larger electrical supply. But that's not defined. But when it says something like plug-in and other self-contained, it kind of widens it to things that are not plug-in. So I would imagine that the dates, the definitions and the scope of these bans are going to be quite crucial in the negotiations that are going on at the moment. I'm happy to answer questions about them later on rather than diving further into it now. Very quickly, metered dose inhalers, that's medical aerosols for treating asthma and COPD. They're currently exempted from the HFC phase down. And that was, they use 134A and 227 as their propellants. And back in 2013, everybody agreed there was no alternative, so we will keep them out of the phase down. In the meantime, the industry, the pharmaceutical industry and the gas supply sector have done a lot of work on alternatives, in particular 152A and HFO 1234ZE. There's also a lot of development in non-aerosol type inhalers, dry powder in particular inhalers. And the leading companies are suggesting that by 2025, they're hoping to have some low GWP MDIs commercially available. But it's a slow process for them getting regulatory approval for a new propellant. It is a massive amount of work. And you have to go to every health authority where you're selling, so if you're manufacturing in the UK or Europe, but exporting it to the US or Australia or wherever, you need medical approval in all of those different regions. It's a slow process. But the proposal, and I'm pretty sure this will happen, is the MDI exemption will be removed because technically there are now possibilities. And there's a sort of fairly complicated, almost parallel quota allocation system for the MDIs, which go rather slower than the phase down that I just showed you for the rest of the market. But the problem is that that applies at the moment anyway to the allocation of quota, but there's only then one basket of quota, and in theory, people from the MDI sector could try and outbid people in the RAC HP market for gas, and no doubt the people selling it will sell it to the highest bidder. So that's MDIs. The quota allocation system is going to change almost certainly. There haven't been too many objections to this. The current quota allocations are free. That has created a lot of issues, in particular the fact that there are a ridiculous number of quota holders. And back in the baseline period, 5 companies supplied over 90% of the refrigerant into Europe, and another 55 companies had tiny amounts that they imported themselves. In 2021, there's 2,000 quota holders because the way it's a silly system, and they realize that. So they're proposing a number of measures to improve the allocation system, not least a fee of €3 per tonne of CO2 to get the quota. And that will kind of cut out people perhaps that are just trying to, game the system. So allocation of quotas is being dealt with, and they're also very conscious of illegal imports into Europe. We probably don't have much of a problem in the UK because of so much, we don't have a land border, but obviously in Eastern Europe it's very easy for refrigerant to be driven across borders from outside the EU. On emission prevention, it's generally just slightly tight. They're retaining all of the stuff that's in the current regulation, which is all very good, about training and record keeping, that sort of thing. They're strengthening some of the measures. Quite importantly, HFOs will be included in all of the leak check and repair requirements. For foams, there's a new proposal for recovery from certain types of foam panels. I was disappointed, and I don't know whether this will change in the trilogues, but that they refer to record keeping via centralized databases, but they don't make it mandatory. And I think that's a real missed opportunity, because I think these databases are a fantastic way of making sure that these various things happen and that people are behaving themselves. And it gives the industry some fantastic data to work from. So that's on emission prevention. And very briefly, the service ban, which came into force in 2020, is retained. It affects the use of virgin refrigerants with a GWP above 2500. I mean, basically, it's targeting R404A. And since 2020, it's been prohibited to service equipment with virgin refrigerant. However, at the moment, there's a threshold of you need to be above 40 tons of CO2 to fall under this ban. And 40 tons of CO2 is, for example, about 10 kilograms of 404A. So what it means is that things like small condensing units and transport systems are generally below this threshold, and in theory they could use virgin 404A for servicing. The proposal is that exemption will be removed. So all equipment using 404A would be affected by the ban. You're allowed to use reclaimed and recycled refrigerants until 2030. So that is that bit. Final thing I would like to talk about very briefly is the possible PFAS bans. So what are PFAS? I'm not even sure I can pronounce it. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And there is a proposal to ban these substances that has been put to an organization called ECHA, which is the European Chemicals Agency. Why is there a proposal to ban them? Because there's a concern that some PFAS are persistent in the environment and potentially toxic, and that they can sort of accumulate, for example, in lakes and watercourses, and not disappear. They're very persistent. The PFAS definition that's being considered is incredibly broad. It affects, I believe, over 10,000 different molecules. And from our perspective, there's two really important things. This definition basically includes virtually all HFC and HFO refrigerants. The only ones that are not PFAS are R32 and 152A. The other thing which I only really started thinking about relatively recently is that most fluoropolymers are PFAS, are fall under the definition of a PFAS. And fluoropolymers are widely used in our equipment as seals, rubber O-rings and gaskets and things like that, used in compressors, in valves, in all sorts of places in our equipment. And it's feasible that this could all get banned. So what's their process? And this is a completely separate process to the F-gas regulation. It's got nothing to do with the F-gas regulation. The proposal was presented to ECHA in February by the countries listed here. ECHA is the agency that manages the REACH regulation. So it's under the REACH regulation that the bans would proceed. They have a couple of very important committees, a risk assessment committee and a socioeconomic analysis committee that will obviously do a deep dive into the proposal that's presented and so on. And there's a public consultation open now, and it's very important that companies put submissions into the public consultation if they feel they've got something to say. As I understand it, the committee opinion is due at the end of this year, and there's some form of second public consultation that will take place early next year. And then there's more sort of bringing this into as a legal requirement. And it's feasible that bans could come into force so maybe by 2026, something like that. The process allows for time-limited derogations in key applications, and that is a really important possibility for the RAC-HP sector. Why are they doing this, and why are they embracing refrigerants as part of it and fluoropolymers as part of it? I'm slightly perplexed, I will be honest with you all. The broad-ranging definition seems to me to capture many chemicals that don't create persistent toxic substances in water or in the ground. In the case of refrigerants, as we know, if they leak as a gas. So they go into the atmosphere. They don't go into water or the ground. Now, obviously, if they are high GWP, that is a really bad thing, hence the F-gas regulation. So we have a regulatory process that is going to cut down the atmospheric impact of those refrigerants. But the refrigerants themselves, as I understand it, or I should say I'm not a chemist, won't persist in water. Now, there are breakdown products from some refrigerants, and in particular, a breakdown product called TFA, trifluoroacetic acid, and TFA is a PFAS. And the TFA is, the breakdown occurs in the atmosphere, a complicated chemical process with sunlight and catalyzing a reaction. But it gets washed out of the atmosphere in rainwater, and it is persistent. There's no question about that. To be fair, most of the refrigerants that we would like to be using produce little or no TFA, as far as I understand it. But there are a couple that do produce more significant amount of TFA. But from reports recently published by the Montreal Protocol Environmental Effects Panel, which is a group of very respected scientists that have been monitoring the environmental effects linked to ozone depletion and anything linked to the Montreal Protocol process. They've recently published a report that says that they don't think that the TFA from refrigerants are going to cause a significant concern. not least because there's already quite a lot of it in the environment from other sources. This is a contentious area. Just briefly on the fluoropolymer side, the way I look at it is that these are incredibly resilient products. The reason that we use them as seals in the harsh environment of a compressor in terms of temperature and pressure and so on is that they don't break down readily into other things. And I would have thought that it would be relatively easy to capture the fluoropolymers that are in old compressors as part of the waste treatment process and make sure that they don't end up in the environment. Yeah, that's what's happening there. So my final slide is basically, this is a very important year. There's a lot going on. There will almost certainly be an F-gas revision this year. It will definitely push harder and faster. And the key question is whether the product bans have got a reasonable timetable or not. The PFAS proposal's completely independent of the F-gas proposal. They could, of course, limit our choice of refrigerants in the future. If the fluoropolymers get affected, it would mean that all of our key components would need redesigning. So pushing for derogations for key RAC HP applications seems to me to be incredibly important. With that, I will pass over back to Neil and on to Graham.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Ray. That's certainly given us a lot to look forward to into today's event. In the meantime, Ray will be joining us shortly for a panel to take we'll take some of your questions on that. But in the meantime, I'm pleased that we also have Graham Fox, both of the IOR and of Technical Director of VISA, and REFCOM, of course, to join us to set the scene from the UK perspective as well. So, Graham, if we can hand over to you.
Morning, Neil. Thank you for having me. I will quickly do a share screen.
Brilliant, we can see that.
Hopefully
Graham.
You can see that. Perfect. Good stuff. Right, I'll crack straight on, be as quick as I can. I know we want to get some questions in. So, thanks very much, Ray, for setting the scene there. You've covered quite a bit of what I was going to say as well, so it's quite handy. I'll be able to zip through this quite quickly. So I've done a very quick slide here, just a lot of information on the page, and appreciate that. Trying to set out the scene from a UK perspective, so GB regulations going forward. As Ray said, EU are well on with their review process. The difference from our perspective in the UK post-Brexit is that we've obviously had to actually create the regulations effectively from scratch. When we left the EU regulations were simply transposed. It was a very simple process, just changing a few words here and there. Essentially, instead of report to the Commission, it's report to the authority, whichever article was being amended. So it was a fairly simple process. The difference now is obviously that we're now looking at effectively a new regulation. And it does give us that opportunity to diverge where it actually suits the UK. I've been pretty vocal over the years since F-gas came in. There are certain aspects of the regulation which have frankly never worked for the UK. Things like the operative register. I've always said we need this operative register. I've been saying it since it was a draft EU directive back in about 2001, long before the F-gas regulations were ever actually a thing. We need it for a control point of view, and I'll come to that later on. So there are certain things like that we need to look at. We've also, I think we tend to be a bit more pragmatic in the UK about how we actually apply regulations, and that's been an issue for certain elements of the F-gas regulation to date that just haven't worked. As I've been saying recently, divergence from the EU regulation is not something we want, and Ray touched on that earlier. And I think from an industry point of view, from manufacturers' point of view, gas suppliers' point of view, everything, you don't really want to be diverging from EU regulations. However, when we know a regulation just simply isn't working, then actually diverging from that regulation and those elements obviously clearly makes sense. And then you'd be pretty stupid not to actually understand that, I think. So legislation timeline, Ray has said he's kind of gone along the same lines as me here. Early 2024, more likely 2025, no longer from a GB regulations point of view. And the stakeholder group meetings, we've been having them over the last year, and I know DEFRA are currently looking at trying to start them up again, or to kind of reinvigorate them again as we start to look to developing the actual UK proposals going forward. I've thrown a slide in here just to give a bit of a context on the amount of refrigerant used. One of the problems that DEFRA had with this new regulation and also doing their assessment report that they published back in December was that when they started looking at this back in 2020, they were looking for data to actually base their assessment report on actual data on refrigerant used. The problem is nobody actually had that data. There was just no such record because all of the refrigerant in use was in an EU market. So nobody actually knew exactly how much of that refrigerant was being used in the UK. And you couldn't even say about where it's, for example, gone into equipment in a manufacturing process or where it was first placed in the market in the EU, because it just could have gone anywhere in the EU from that point onwards. So, for example, refrigerant used in the Mitsubishi factory in Livingston could have been going anywhere in Europe. So it's not actually refrigerant being used and consumed, if you like, in the UK market. Similarly, Daikin factory in Ostend, that could be coming into the UK. So they had a very big problem. What we did, one of the reasons why I teamed up with JobLogic as a service management company, a service software company, a few years ago, was actually to start collating data in the cloud anonymously, and what that allowed us to do was do a data dump from the whole of 2021, which showed us all of the refrigerant used in the UK. So that's both what comes pre-charged in equipment, what's trim charged or field charged, what's been recovered, what's been sent for destruction, what's been recycled or reclaimed. So really, really useful information that DEFRA were able to get their heads around, and then they used that then for the basis of their assessment report published in December. I've just taken this out of the assessment report that DEFRA did, because it does kind of show the savings on emissions that have been made, and what it does show is that, you know, although we've come a long way, and as Ray pointed out, there's been some really good cuts to date on the emissions that we've had in the industry, but we've still got a fair bit to go. And we've still got some work to do. 58% of the emissions are still coming from split AC and commercial refrigeration systems. I have my theories as to why they come from split AC units. They tend to be coming from the fact that we have an unregulated sales route still. Despite there being regulations, there are still loopholes, and many of you know I've been quite vocal in trying to shut down or control the online sales route because it's an absolute shambles, and that's where most of the leakage in split AC actually comes from. But as I say, we are getting there. So this is the phased in steps that we had in the original regulation, and Ray's already kind of covered this, which is fantastic. It means I can really kind of skip over it quite quickly. But I put it in just to remind people about the phase down steps, and these are kind of average GWP figures that we had. So the average GWP of all of the gas that's placed in the market as of now, effectively this year, is 900 compared to 2000 back in 2015. So it's half the refrigerant essentially. Now we've done some great strides. The change, particularly if you look at the air conditioning market, kind of VRFs and split systems, or not so much VRF, it's coming now, but the split system market in particular, we've changed and transitioned quite easily from A1 to A2L refrigerants because of the widespread uptake of R32, in particular in smaller systems, and there are other refrigerants that can be used as drop-ins for replacing 407C and 410A, which is great. And what that's done is it's massively dropped that GWP level of the refrigerants in use, which has allowed us to meet these targets not painlessly, but it's allowed us to actually meet them. The prospect of change, the concept of changing, I should say, from A1 to A2L for the manufacturers wasn't a massively difficult thing to do. The prospect of changing from A to A2 or A3 refrigerants is, of course, a different matter altogether, because what we're looking at is highly flammable refrigerants. Now, from a manufacturer's point of view, that means things like intrinsically safe switching, sealed parts, which is a very big change of component design or component use in some of these systems. So it's not an easy job to do that. And let's not forget as well, there's a lot of talk about, oh, we can, technically we can change over to hydrocarbons in all these systems. Well, yeah, technically we can in many, many cases, but just because something is technically feasible from a manufacturing point of view doesn't mean that you can actually apply that in practice in many places in the real world. And I know from my contracting days, which seem a lifetime ago now, but from my contracting days, we had massive problems with some of the sites I worked on. I did a lot of MOD work, I did a lot of airport work and stuff like that, train stations. And all of these places have very strict bans on the use of anything flammable. So you have massive problems with actually applying flammable refrigerants in some of these locations. There is the training aspect as well, of course, handling of flammable refrigerants. In the UK, we're actually probably one of the better countries across Europe. We have had in place for a few years now some good hydrocarbon training and flammable training courses. We have, I don't know how many, but we have a few thousand of the F-gas qualified technicians have actually done these courses now, which is great. We are getting there. We're still not there, but we're getting there. A lot of the countries across Europe haven't even created their flammable training courses yet, let alone set up training centres to deliver them, let alone start delivering them. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of technicians and AC and fridge engineers right across Europe who are already handling or will be handling flammable refrigerants in the very near future, who have had zero training in the implications of handling flammable refrigerants. And that's clearly not a safe prospect. And I get sent pictures all the time from colleagues of mine in the through my UNIP contacts from the U3ARC, which is the African Trade Association, and there's some pretty horrific cases of untrained people using flammable refrigerants there that are coming through on a weekly basis to me, and it really drives home how important it is we make sure we actually get that upskilling at a global level, and I'm happy to talk about that later. I haven't done a slide on that, I don't think. So Ray's touched on this rapid phase down proposals come out of the European Commission, and he's also touched on a really important aspect of that, the metered dose inhalers being included in this level. What the Commission's proposal is essentially to ramp down to where we were at that 7 to 9% that Ray said, and he said it was down to 94.8%. So that's 5.2% of the 2015 total refrigerant placing on the market would be available to us in just, I say us, it's actually the EU, this is the GB proposals, in just 7 years' time, which is unthinkable. It's important to remember what this phase down actually is. Ray kind of reminded of it with one of his slides earlier, because we talk about this phase down, and the phase down is actually a placing on the market ban. So when you're thinking placing in the market, what people are thinking about is new products being sold and placed on the market for the first time. That's the technical definition of placing on the market. But this is actually the refrigerant. So this is all of the refrigerant being placed on the market. So it's not just in the new equipment, it's actually servicing, and Ray did touch on this, it's servicing all of the existing equipment that's out there. So it essentially means if someone has installed a system 5, 6, 7 years ago, and then within a couple of years is not going to be able to get that refrigerant, and there is no drop-in replacement for that refrigerant, because there aren't in some cases, and you can't drop in a flammable refrigerant into some of these systems, particularly if they're installed, like I say, in airports or military bases. What are you supposed to do? The only option to you is actually stripping out that equipment and replacing it wholesale with new equipment. So not only is there a massive commercial cost to that, in environmental terms, the carbon footprint of stripping out, scrapping perfectly good equipment, perfectly serviceable equipment, and replacing that is enormous. And I don't think the environmentalists have actually considered that impact. That kind of carbon, the total carbon footprint, is a massive, massive factor on this debate. I've touched on this one purely because this is to come back on what I was saying about some of the things that we need to diverge on. So operative register. Back in about 2001, 2002, the F-gas regulation was actually originally going to be a directive. It was a draft directive. And I was talking about the need for company and operative registration at the time. And actually in the original F-gas regulation, it was in there for an operative register. From UK's perspective, it was agreed with DEFRA that REFCOM would be the company register and ACRA would be the operative register. As it happens, at the 11th hour in Europe, the need or requirement for an operative register was dropped from the draft legislation. And then DEFRA issued 4 company registers. There's actually 3 F-gas registers in the UK now. REFCOM is by far the largest. I think we have 7,800 registered businesses on the REFCOM register now. Now, when the F-gas regulations came in, we had an estimate of 5,000 to 6,000 businesses operating. So I don't know what percentage of the market REFCOM has now, because the Environment Agency don't actually publish the total numbers anymore, but it's got to be well over 90%, which is great. We've effectively got the one register, which is important because it actually helps industry to police itself, and because REFCOM is the only register that was actually set up by industry for industry. So it's really important that we have that ability to actually monitor where people are going. We have a very fluid workforce in our industry. We have F-gas and refrigeration engineers changing their employ all the time. We have some of them who are working for a number of different companies as a subcontractor, and they should be registered themselves, which we're starting to see that, which is one of the reasons why we have more businesses registered than we used to have. But what we have found at REFCOM in a number of cases is we've had unscrupulous companies who have used subcontractors, asked for their F-gas certificate, so their City and Guilds 2079 or equivalent, and they've said they needed it for insurance purposes. They've then used that certificate to register with REFCOM or one of the other 2 registers, and that actual engineer has no idea, but it allows that company to be registered and therefore buy equipment, buy refrigerant, and act unscrupulously. We do come across it every now and again, usually under audit, sometimes, and most of the time it's actually through the engineer finding that the qualifications being used inappropriately, and they've complained to us. They've given us the evidence, allows us to actually clamp down on it. But we do need a bit more of that whistleblowing. What an operative register does is it would actually allow us to cross-check the registers from the company register, who the registered engineers are, with the operative register, and we would know who those operatives work for, so it would stop that kind of fraud happening. It's a really simple thing to do, would have virtually no impact on the industry from an actual technician point of view or a business point of view, but from an authority point of view and the compliance point of view, it would massively help us better serve you. I guess that's the point. Ray's touched on the placing in the market bans. I put this in really because I want to touch on this phrase, except when required to meet safety standards, and Ray had that there. He had a table in there as well with a few of these proposed bans. Really important, because what the Commission's done with this is when they spoke to us as industry a few years ago, when they were drafting these proposals, and they were saying about, bring in these additional bans and not allowing anything more than 150 GWP in split systems up to 12 kilowatts, which is a fair size of split system, by the way, and a fair amount of R290 as the case would normally be. And we explained this point about it's not technically feasible, but it's not practically applicable. And what they've done is they've put in this little except when required to meet safety standards. Now, that's all well and good, because they think they're being clever, saying, well, okay, where safety standards allow it, then you must use a GWP gas, a gas with a GWP of less than 150. But where the safety standards don't allow that, then it's okay. You can continue to use something over 150 GWP, probably R32, but it's flammable as well. The problem is that if that accelerated phase down takes place, there won't be any refrigerant available anyway. So it doesn't matter what exemptions you put in place allowing the use of something. If you have actually stopped the sale of that thing in the first place by a phase down, effectively preventing the placing on the market in the first place, doesn't matter. You will not be able to get that refrigerant. And this is where we have a lack of joined up thinking by the European Commission. They're just unwilling to actually discuss practical implications. Ray touched on the presidency implications. The Swedish government came in at 1st of January this year. When the Czech Republic had the presidency the last 6 months of last year, I think I met with the Czech Environment Minister 3-4 times. Open, they were very engaging and wanted to know the implications of what was being proposed. The Swedes, on the other hand, have just said, no, not interested. They haven't allowed a single meeting with anyone in the industry. That's partly because they don't want to hear bad news. They don't want to hear inconvenient truths. And it's also partly because of this huge political will within the Commission to get this done before June. The Spanish take over on the 1st of July as the presidency of the EU, and Spain will be a lot more practical on this side of things because they understand the implications of it far better than the Swedes do. And I think there's a concern within the Commission that some of the stuff would be actually pushed back a bit and eased off a little bit because of pragmatic reasons. For the UK perspective, the UK government has been a lot more engaging on the subject. They understand the implications much better. There was a phrase in the assessment report, I think, about the understanding that the model that's been proposed by the EU is just unworkable for the GB market, the UK market, and I think that's absolutely spot on. So those conversations are ongoing. We can only hope really that common sense will prevail. And with that, I've rushed through it there, Neil.
Brilliant, thank you guys. That's I mean, I don't think we can get much more detail in from the two of you, but thank you so much, Graham, for setting us out there. Been getting plenty of questions coming in, which is always what we like to see. So I was going to ask you, Graham, I can ask you to stay on. We're going to ask Ray Gluckman to come back and join us, and Mark Hughes of Comores and current BRA president, I can speak, to join us for our first panel. I think I need some help on putting some of these questions to you, but good morning, gents. So thanks. I mean, I'll move straight on to the audience questions just in a minute, but I guess looking on what Graham and Ray, you've been saying about the process and where we stand, I guess from the UK and the EU side, there's probably a sense the complications of this, you know, and I'll bring you in first, Mark, but what industry, what do it, you know, beyond industry bodies, which obviously are having a voice on this, what is there that can be done? I mean, particularly, I know we can feel quite powerless in these aspects there to try and perhaps raise some of these practical issues that Graham's raised there. When looking at that, and I guess balancing as well that there are, at the same time, we've got the RAU power, I can say it right with these, but we have got these overarching ambitions in the UK and the EU for net zero and issues like that as well, which I guess can be quite conflicting. If we need these ambitious targets, we've got to sort of move that on. So I guess what, you know, with our listeners sort of coming in, what can be done to I guess steer this, to kind of make their voices heard? I've opened with you, Mark, and I can push that to the rest of the panel then.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Yeah, thanks to the other guys for sort of like, you know, setting up the scene as it were. But and both have mentioned the consultation processes. Now, obviously, you know, I'm chairman of FITA, which covers both, you know, not only refrigeration, but also air conditioning and heat pumps. So all refrigerant users in one way or another. So we have, you know, as a trade association, and then obviously with the BRA specifically, you know, the ability to engage with government. And we're you know, that's a process, and that's happening. And Graham's already talked about this, that, you know, there's meetings with DEFRA, you know, they're open to dialogue, they're in listening mode. And I think you've heard that before, you know, they are in listening mode. But I think my message is, it's not just about the trade bodies, working on behalf of, the industry within the UK specifically, we have a chance of getting something that's better made for UK industry by getting our voices heard. And so it's not just through the trade body, but obviously I encourage, people within the, the industry within the UK to join trade associations. Obviously, that's my call to arms for that, and we will work on your behalf. But it's also important that the individual companies do their own, put their own entries into the consultation when it comes around and get their voices known, and the stakeholder groups that come up. So, if we're passive and, and our voices are not heard, then things will happen which are not friendly to our industry. It's going to be tough anyway. I mean, the changes are going to be tough whatever happens. It's going to be, there's a phase down and there's going to be some bans there. But the question is to try and make things as possible as they can be. So that's merely my call from this. But I think the other guys, I think Ray and Graham have teed it up very well of what some of the challenges are that we are facing.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I guess going back there, I mean, some of the questions we've got in really are about the need for ambition there. I guess in terms of so where do we begin to look, perhaps, if there are concerns about the practical side of delivering on this, about sort of compromise wise, is there any hope? I know, Graham, you've mentioned that they're and Ray was talking about sort of the horseplay that will be involved there. Is there a sense of proposals or compromise coming from the industry, or how should we, I guess, brace for what some of these changes could well be, particularly ambitious stuff?
I think the problem is you only get compromise when you have people coming to the table with different views, and the European Parliament has always come with a far more hardline view. It's exactly the same in the last review process back in 12-13, when they were having the discussions in Parliament then, and they came with a much more ambitious line than the Commission had. I don't think it wasn't unexpected that we're going to have exactly the same thing in this case. But the problem is that they've come with a very similar position this time. So if you actually come to the table with the same position, then you're not going to have that kind of compromise. Ambition's a good thing. Absolutely applaud ambition. But you have to be practical as well. You have to actually understand the implications of what your ambition is actually and potentially planning. I have ambitions to drive a Formula 1 car. But the reality is I would probably kill myself in 5 minutes if I actually got behind the wheel of one. Ambition's great. It's nice to have things to strive for. And that's what ambition is. Ambition is actually a target. It's something, it's a goal to aim towards. It's a desire to achieve something or to do something. That's what ambition actually means. So it's all very well having that desire, but to go too rapidly at actually attaining that target or that goal, when it has very serious implications, is frankly ludicrous. And I've been really dismayed by the attitude of the EU lawyers on this. The actual team at DG Klima are very good. It's the same team that's been working with this for a long time. They know us, they know how things work, and they've been very open in the discussions that I've been having with them for the last, 2.5 years, 3 years, I guess, on the subject. The problem is that they're being held. They're having to work with their hands tied behind the back by the EU lawyers, and they're being driven by Frans Timmermans' team, who just, they're blinkered by ambition, and it's a really dangerous thing to let ambition blind yourself to the implications. And I think that's what we're seeing in the EU, and that's why, as both Ray and I have touched on, it's been actually quite heartening to have a more pragmatic approach by the UK government, that DEFRA are actually listening and they're having proper grown-up conversations about it. I think that's probably the way I would put it.
And just to sort of add to what Graham said there, I think what worries me about the ambition is that it's ambition related to the chemicals, but both under the F-gas regulation and to the PFAS discussion, without recognizing that they are going to do significant damage to climate change. Mm-hmm. Because if if the PFAS, well, if either the very, very challenging product bans under the F-gas regulation or the PFAS bans come into place, but for a period of a significant number of years, the industry will struggle to have products of the highest energy efficiency to supply to the market. That's the big problem to me, is that they put F-gases into a silo and they haven't analyzed energy properly. They've made sweeping assumptions that propane can be equally efficient to an HFC in, let's say, the less than 12 kilowatts category where there's a ban. The analysis that was done they analysed R410A, R32, and propane. They didn't analyse any other gases. They didn't analyse a sort of HFO blend with GWP under 150, for example. And the assumptions in the analysis report imply actually that over half the market from January of next year will, this is the under 12 kilowatts air-to-air split market, which is a massive market, that half of it is going to be on propane by next January, and 90% of it by January 2025. But in 2023, my understanding is 1% or less than 1% of that market is going to be using propane. So now that doesn't mean that by 2030 or 2032, 2034, that we can't be using quite a bit of propane in that market. That might be possible. But to assume that it can be done in an instant is unreal. And so the likelihood is that manufacturers will rush to put things on the market. They won't have time to optimize, and the efficiency will drop. As soon as the efficiency drops, you're going to get more greenhouse gas emissions from the energy than you're saving from a little bit of HFC. And that is particularly true about heat pumps, that if we do anything to slow the rollout of heat pumps, then we will massively increase the amount of fossil fuel emissions over the next, say, 5 to 10 years.
And don't forget as well that massive rollout of the propane systems is a rollout of millions of heat pumps and split systems that are completely unregulated because they are out of scope of the regulations, which means technically you don't have to have any qualifications, you don't have to have any registration. Any Tom, Dick or Harry can install a propane split system under law. And that's just crazy. Now, I know you have a much lower GWP than you do with 410A or 134 or any of these other HFC refrigerants. But actually, when you're going to be releasing thousands of kilograms of a gas with a GWP of 3, that's thousands of tons equivalent CO2 of refrigerant that's just going to be getting released because these systems get installed by people who don't know what they're doing. We get it all the time. We get evidence sent to us of poor installations, propane systems bought online by unscrupulous sellers, installed by the homeowner, and then they call out a reputable company because they're like, oh, this system's not working, it's a load of rubbish. It's nothing to do with the system, it's the fact that it's been installed by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And that is going to just, as we rapidly transition towards this kind of looking at 95% of systems in an unregulated market, it's just crazy. And why anybody would want that is beyond belief, really.
I mean, it sounds like really we're talking a lot about prepping the industry. There's an element of having to prep the industry from a skills base and things like that there. But to move into some of the other questions we've got here, because I know we've got quite a few coming in. I know we've got some limited time with you, but one of the ones possibly is for you there, Graham, but someone's asking about obviously where we are with the planned launch for the UK side and the EU as well, but about the change in supply of refrigerants with Northern Ireland and that there, about will that still, when we talk about the UK on its own, there is obviously, we've had that challenge of Northern Ireland still being linked to EU regulation there. Is there any, have we had any clarity, in a sense, people are asking on that as yet, or would that still be the case potentially that Northern Ireland would, that we'd have to factor in whatever the commission eventually puts in there?
It's still very much an ongoing conversation. The situation in Northern Ireland is extremely difficult because of the single market implications. Yeah. And it's something that has never actually been addressed. Our members in Northern Ireland have massive problems. They tend to be buying refrigerant from Southern Ireland, and yet their UK legal qualifications and registration isn't actually valid in the Republic of Ireland. So yeah, there's huge implications. The transfer of refrigerant. I've had instances where there's equipment that's gone from the UK over to the Republic of Ireland a couple of years ago. It's a warranty thing. It needs to come back to the factory. So maybe I'm talking about kind of rooftop chillers or something like that. The system legally can't come from Ireland to the UK because it has contaminated waste in it. And if the system is decanted to get around that instance and they send the unit back dry to the UK can't then send it back with gas in it, because then they're putting UK or GB quota gas into the Republic of Ireland. It's a really crazy situation. There's silly little things like that, loopholes that have been left in legislation. And frankly, the sooner the politicians bang their heads together and sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol, the better for all round. But there's no clarity, I'm afraid. No, lots of discussions.
A line. Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm not asking you to know the whole thing there, but no, that's great. Thank you, Graham. The other one that was just one of the questions David Richards here about. Does anyone know or have the best guess about the actual refrigerant sort of sales, the average GWP is yet refrigerant being sold? I think the question they've been asked, as opposed to the sort of 900 value there that they're saying that's been placed on the market by quota holders. I don't know, this might be one, Ray, in terms of your ideas about how the actual sort of change in that sense of average GWP is that sort of factor, I guess, that's thinking at the minute.
Yeah, I mean, we're meeting the requirements. Bear in mind, the market for refrigerants is probably bigger than it was before the regulation. Certainly, in terms of the stock of equipment throughout Europe is growing. Not least because of heat pumps, but not only heat pumps. I mean, there's air conditioning. If we get 1 or 2 months of really hot summer in this country, we will suddenly jump from being a country with virtually no residential air conditioning to potentially having quite a significant amount. So the quantities of gas needed are probably going up, and the fact that we're meeting the phase down targets sort of imply we've shifted massively away from the high GWP refrigerants. So 404A was a very significant part of the pie back in the baseline period. Well, back as recently as 2015, 404A was a big consumer. It's kind of gone almost from the market. There's a trickle of 404A being sold. As Graham said, the 410A, which is the next highest GWP refrigerant, a lot of that is swinging towards R32. Now, with the right ambition, we need to move away from 32 to something with a much lower GWP. That's what this whole F-gas regulation is trying to force. But it's my fear is just one of timing. That to force it in 2 or 3 years is just unbelievably naive. I heard somebody say, and this was an official from the Commission, we managed to transition from 410A to 32 in 4 years. Therefore, we can transition from 32 to propane in the next 4 years. Well, that's comparing chalk and cheese. The transition to 32, you have thermodynamically a gas that's almost identical to the starting gas. So the compressors are roughly the same size, the heat exchangers are roughly the same. There's a bit of optimization to do. You need to deal with the fact that it's a 2L flammability refrigerant. But that was relatively easy to do. And it didn't happen in 4 years. It took in Japan about 10 years of development, and we piggybacked onto that. And in 4 years, we started using that technology. But to switch to propane or an HFO, HFC blend with a GWP under 150, you're switching from a high pressure refrigerant like 410A and 32 to a medium pressure refrigerant. So the compressor is going to be bigger, the heat exchanger pipes are going to be bigger. It's a complete redesign of your equipment, and it isn't going to happen in 4 years. It needs to be encouraged to happen. Don't get me wrong. I don't wish there to be an unambitious regulation. I'd love it to be ambitious, but I just don't want it to be impossible.
It's great. I mean, I'm going to ask you to have some thoughts on summary. I appreciate with all these questions, we're not going to be able to answer all, but we'll definitely be having time encouraged to follow up. And I know with other events we've got planned to follow up on some of these questions here. The one I did want to ask about is someone saying as we look at a growing number of systems, or it's R290 or other refrigerants there, but while we wait for the UK to make its F-gas decision in this country, is there anything possible, or is there anything likely to change with regards to improvement of monitoring or installation standards, Graham, things like R290 systems and alternatives in the meantime, or are we dependent? Is this now, as Ray said, are we looking now for the next of F-gas to move us into that and being prepped for?
Yeah, I mean, what we need, and what I've really encouraged DEFRA to do with the GB regulations, is to include all of the refrigerants in the regulation going forward, because we need to have that. You can't have some refrigerants that are regulated and some that aren't. They all have implications. There's actually a very simple process just by taking the word fluorinated out of the regulations, where you actually include every single refrigerant except ammonia. And it's a really simple process, because everything, even CO2, is a greenhouse gas. It just becomes a greenhouse gas emissions regulation. It's a really simple process. There's nothing in there to actually address that as an interim in answer to the question. No, because there's simply no mechanism at the moment for including those refrigerants. So if there's no legal mechanism, then there is no legal opportunity for any type of monitoring. So we have to wait for the legislation. All we can do is push for that legislation to be done properly, sensibly, and to actually address the concerns that we all have, any responsible person has.
Having looked at, obviously, with the complexity of what we've talked about today, I'm going to do the classic. It's a really complicated issue, but if as we close out the panel, to I guess your message, your simple, easy message about in a very complex process of moving forward now in next year, what should we expect, or what can we do best to prepare? I guess your message to industry, if I can ask each of you. Graham, if I perhaps start with you, and then Ray, and then I'll move to Mark as well, if that's all right. About what you see.
I love how you always put us on the spot like this. I think the message to government is obviously pragmatism is desperately needed. We need that to make the regulations work better for everyone longer term. And I think my message to contractors is don't be too afraid of it. Obviously, be afraid of the fact they're going to have a refrigerant coming, but from a training point of view and a qualifications point of view, very little is actually going to change. We already have the requirement in our training programs for upskilling with knowledge of the alternatives, which means knowledge of how to handle flammable refrigerants. That will be embedded. Pretty 99% certain that will actually be embedded as a mandatory upskilling requirement. But apart from that, it's not going to be a wholesale training course. It's really a top up. If you've already got your F-gas and your MVQs and stuff like that, it's really going to be a top up. And that is really, really necessary, just to mandate that handling of the alternatives, because there are safety implications. It's not all about environmental implications. There are also safety implications. So kind of twofold message: one for government, one for contractors. Manufacturers, whew, that's another kettle of fish.
We got to keep some things open. We've got to have
absolutely
a hook there. Ray, if I could just move to yourself. So I know we've had a lot to discuss, but
yeah, I mean, I would just encourage people to try to make submissions to the process in Europe, if possible. I mean, for the F-gas regulation itself, it's probably too late. But for the PFAS process, there's public consultation only just started. And I think people should try to, if we need to get derogations, if this whole PFAS thing goes through the way it's currently proposed, we need to get derogations for RAC HP, or we will be really struggling. Yeah, and the people at this ECHA organization need to understand that.
So it's kind of arguing, I guess in that way, arguing the value of F-gas from what we've seen as well, about the ability for it to, that it is about controlling these substances.
Yeah.
Being used. Brilliant, thank you, Ray, that's great. And Mark, if I could shift to you and get your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same theme really, and that is to get involved. Don't be passive. The industry, we're at a time, we're a very regulated industry anywhere. We have been for many years, and we continue to be so. But we have an ability to affect what, particularly what regulations come into the UK. Again, it is different with F-gas in the EU. To some extent, that's being done, via the member states, and we don't have a say in that anymore, but we do have an ability to influence not only the regulators in the UK, but also the politicians that are going to vote on those F-gas proposals. It would be the first time that UK MPs will have voted on F-gas, because previously it's been MEPs. So there's a whole different raft there in terms of, like writing to your local MP about, give my local food producer the ability to service his equipment, for instance. It's things that at grassroots level like that we're going to need as a call to arms to defend, the options that we have, and we will transition. Given time, we will transition to more environmentally friendly products, but it takes time, and we need to keep our industry going, particularly things like food production, food storage, transport, and whatever going in the meantime. Otherwise, we're going to face severe penalties as a separate nation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, guys, for that one there. I think that's a pretty useful way of getting our head round, at least beginning to get a head round for some of the industry, that there is hope there, which is always like to have a bit of positivity on that one. And so I'd just like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank Ray Gluckman and Graham Fox for both joining us this morning to share their thoughts and to take some questions on. Apologise, there isn't time to get to everything people wanted to ask. But I think that sort of shows the passion of the project somewhat there. With moving on,
Thank you.
I was going to then introduce Mark. Now you're going to stay with us for a bit, as I was sponsored to talk a little bit, just briefly from Comores about some of the technical opportunities that are there to start to tackle some of the challenges that we've been talking about, I guess. So I move on to you on that one, Mark.
Yeah, just sharing my screen.
Let me make sure it's looking.
Can you see my screen?
Saying it started. Yes, you're all good, Mark.
Good. Okay. Well, again, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. As you said, Neil, it's not all doom and gloom. There are solutions available out there, given the chance to actually use them. But that's partly what we're trying to do in terms of through the consultations, etc. I mean, I started on this slide, which is really what's happening with GB phase down. That's the big step there next year. No matter what happens, that step's going to occur. In the EU, it might actually be deeper. The average GWP goes down to about 600 at a time. So there's steps that need to be taken within that. Who knows, as the legislation comes through in GB, some of those steps might be further decreased. It's just going to create additional challenges for industry. So let's look down how we can prepare for those next phase down steps. So first of all, to say business as usual is not an option. let's go through the different refrigerants that you could be using. Well, first of all, virgin refrigerants greater than a GWP of 2500. Now, basically, and then there's a bit of 403, virgin that you can still use in very limited places. But effectively, we're talking about only reclaim product being possible. And of course, reclaim, Chemours is getting involved with reclaim, particularly of some of the newer products as we move forward. But it's limited availability. You can only use what it comes back from the market, is recovered and then reclaimed by the reclaimers out there. So pretty much a done deal as far as greater than 2500 GWP is today. If we look at that refrigerants in the 1500 to 2500 mark, the key messages are, don't use those for new installations or even for retrofit if lower GWP options are available. An example in this case, for instance, is R410A, which fits in that range. It's not wise, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on, not wise to install new R410A equipment today. There are alternatives available. And then our product XP44 R452A is also on that higher level, and we're discouraging new installations or retrofit to that product as well, because it's just too high now to face up to the new phase down limits that are coming, the new quota levels. We move on to the 1500 to 650 level. These are ideal retrofit options. So, but only consider them for retrofit where you need to, and really these should not be used for new equipment, except where you don't have other options. An example of that is R449A, which is our Option XP40. Very well used, and it's a refrigerant of choice. But actually, for new equipment, it doesn't make sense now when we've reached this position where we need to go to an average of 600 from next year. As we move further down to the 650 to 300 GWP range, we can see here good sustainability for use in new equipment. So we've got products there like our XP10 513A as an A1 134A replacement, and then we've got R454B, which is our Option XL41, which is used in new chillers, and this shows a good level of sustainability long term in that area. When we go below 300, of course, that's the very best area for new installs. Unfortunately, because of the properties of these refrigerants, they're not typically suitable for retrofit. Either safety, it could be flammability, or it could be pressure in the case of CO2. And we see here products like R454C, which is Option XL20, is now becoming a popular less than 300 or even less than 150 in that case GWP. And then of course CO2 and propane are also available in that area as well. So I'm called this insurance for the future. So we need to insure ourselves from from the changes that are occurring, and we got to look into the future. Equipment installed today may be in service. Well, 15 years might be a minimum. In many cases, is equipment around that's more than 20 years old. So what you put into use today, you've got to be able to service it. And looking at some of those phase down, you're going to struggle if you use some of the higher GWP refrigerants, and that will certainly limit new equipment lifetime if you go for those higher GWP products. There's limited retrofit options. In the past, one thing that's happened recently is that we're limited to what we can use now to retrofit. So in the past, we used to be able to retrofit, from HCFCs into HFCs, from HFCs to HFO blends, but those chances are now becoming much more difficult because of the differing properties of the materials that are the newer, lower GWP refrigerants. But new installs with the lowest GWP will have the longest lifetime, and that's clear. That the lower you go, the better off you are. But just at the end there, we need to consider the lifetime performance. Ray mentioned, we may be restricted to products which have poorer performance. And we need to look at that to make sure that we've got the right products for the right applications. So looking at the refrigerant decision criteria, use the lowest GWP you can for the application, but consider, the performance of the product. Does it actually do the adequate cooling? I've marked particularly their energy efficiency. It's a key part. If you look at heat pumps, why use a heat pump if you're using a refrigerant there that makes it inefficient? You're losing in terms of the electricity that you're having to consume to run that piece of equipment. Reliability, particularly in food production and whatever you want product that's going to give you reliability and not cause food spoilage, for instance. Total cost of ownership, always very difficult to take that and look at the 15-20 year lifetime, compared to what the current, the capital cost of installation. What does it cost you over lifetime? And that includes the energy used to run that equipment. And then again, safety and ease of installation, that puts up the difference between using an A1 refrigerant, an A2L, or even an A3, and specifically those higher flammable products, or ones with toxicity or indeed high pressure. I mean, the good news is that there's widespread equipment availability today. Things have changed now. There's a lot of product implemented around the place in retail, in supermarkets. We've seen some great results, even where CO2 has been replaced by A2L in retailers. The use of very low GWP refrigerants in convenience stores, in food production and storage, in rooftop chillers and heat pumps, and indeed even now in heat pumps with products like our R454C XL20 being introduced by Daikin into their heat pump range. So I say it's not all doom and gloom. There are products available there. Obviously, we need to fight to make sure that they're available for us to use in the coming years, but we can get on and use them and meet at least the phase down requirements that come. And these are, the products that we manufacture are long-term sustainable solutions, and you can actually use them right now, which means that you can start to insure yourself as we go forward. So that's it from me, Neil. Pass it back to you.
Yes, please. Thank you, Mark. I know you're going to stay with us, get our value out of you today. I know we've got you on a big shift, but yes, delighted to say we've got the final panel of today. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about the policy side of this issue, but also as Mark's presentation alluded to, that we've got these technical challenges. And I know he would say that also there's an opportunities there as well to sort of prepare ourselves there. So I'm delighted to say we've brought together an expert panel of people in know really to talk about this. So they'll be joining Mark today. We've got Neil Roberts of IDS Climalife, Brian Churchyard of Consultancy Amiga Solutions, and Chris Chisholm as well, Director of Master TV. So thank you all guys for joining us there on this one. I guess the theme of the panel, what we're looking at here is prepping for a new regime, and I guess part of that as well is the transition challenges that we're seeing there. So I was going to start, if I could, by asking each member of the panel what they see from a technical side is the main priority at the minute in terms of making sure you're ready for the transition or better placed to take that on. I guess I'll start, Brian, if I may start with you, and I'll come round to Neil, Chris, and then back to Mark as well on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Some great insight from Graham and Ray, and I think just all the detail that they went through kind of shows how challenging the situation is at the moment. I think certainly from a technical perspective, and I think it was alluded to in their presentations, was the absolute importance of knowing what it is you're dealing with from a design installation perspective. Unintended consequences are a result of not going into the detail of any application of any technology, whatever it might be. Obviously, in this instance, talking about refrigeration systems, specifically refrigerants, that we play a game of whack-a-mole, fairground games, was something that is a highly technical area. And if you don't understand the details around what it is actually dealing with, and you're just looking in isolation at the GWP of a refrigerant, don't be surprised when you have unintended consequences. And I think this is probably one of the challenges and frustrations in Graham's conversations with individuals that are not maybe as technically qualified as people in the industry are, to help them understand what those unintended consequences could be. I think probably the one at the top of that ladder is energy consumption. We should not be replacing refrigeration systems with systems that are burning more energy, because if you're doing that, you're putting more carbon in the atmosphere. Granted, certain markets will decarbonize, but it's also costs money. It's kilowatt hours at the end of the day. So you've got to technically understand what it is you're actually doing from one system to another.
That's brilliant. Neil, if I could, put that to similar to what Brian's discussing there about what you would see as the sort of technical priorities really for, I guess people will be listening today and thinking the big challenges here, and I guess in terms of the comfort, if there is such a thing, about where to start, or as Brian said, getting that understanding of what you need and what you're doing.
I mean, absolutely. One of the big things for me is, we've been through this cycle a few times now, CFCs, HCFCs, and there's a big danger that everyone just thinks it's the same again. I've been there before. Last time when the other stuff I was using ran out, I could just drop something else in. This is a completely different situation. You are not in a situation where when 449A, for example, you can't get hold of it, you can't drop something else into that system unless that system's already been designed for the new product. Nearly most of the products we're looking at, which are low GWP, have a very different performance profile. So if you put them in, they're going to work in a completely different way, or they have a completely different safety classification, and then you run into compliance with legislation issues. So you need to be aware of that. Putting in equipment today, you need to be aware that what you're putting in is going to be, you're going to be able to get the refrigerant into the future as well. And you can't rely on a situation where, I'll just switch to something else, because in many cases that's not going to be possible. So installing the right refrigerant today is really important, or at least designing the equipment. I know Brian did a lot of work in his previous life, making sure that his employer had a situation where they were installing equipment which was ready to be retrofitted to something lower GWP. If you're not doing that, if you're not designing the equipment for the lower GWP products, you're really going to be in a big problem when that comes along. And it's getting much easier. The equipment is much easier. The assistance, people are getting more familiar with using these products. The assistance is available now. There's no reason why people shouldn't be doing it.
That's brilliant. Thank you there, Neil. And Chris, then if I can move to you with that as well. I know we're moving get on a bit, but I think it's quite interesting while we've got you all to sort of talk about that, the idea of prepping yourself, I guess, and being ready, which I know we talk about a lot, but obviously, as we said, this is big changes, so we expect to be coming both EU and UK wise. So I think for readers, it's kind of interesting for the audience to get an idea of what they can begin to do or what they should be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, definitely just being on, listening to this panel and getting yourself informed in terms of what's going on in terms of the regulations. I mean, for us, we're a manufacturer we make CO2 equipment and we make A2L equipment. And, the difficulty at the moment, I think, is uncertainty. People, ask us, you've got some CO2 equipment, why did you move into A2Ls? And I think part of it is in terms of what Ray said, in terms of the legislation and what everybody else has kind of said, is that the A2Ls give you, an opportunity in terms of, reducing the phase down faster in terms of the ambition that we want to do. Allowing the A2Ls and having them there as an option and using the A2Ls give you a much greater scope to have a quicker phase down in terms of, CO2 being the biggest problem for the planet at the moment. We want that ambition, but also, as we mentioned, energy as well, which is like the secondary part of it. So for us, the development of it, in terms of the product also being a cheaper option, a cheaper running option, but also more environmentally in terms of from a CO2 point of view, it seemed like an absolute no-brainer for us to move forward with it. I think, and in terms of where we are now, in terms of the F-gas regulations, and they're going to be changing very soon for a much faster phase down, it really is the time to start looking at, at these alternatives and getting the training that you need to be able to do, and to work with this type of equipment.
That's great, because I mean, I guess specifically from your work, I know some of Brian works as well. We always talk about there's no silver bullet, which I guess is helpful if you know what you're doing there. But sometimes I guess it's as you said, the energy, the unintended consequences. It's getting that understanding of what the best option might be for you, which I know is the eternal challenge on some of that there. And I mean, part of the panel obviously to want to bring in some of the questions, and as I've got you there, Chris, I'll start. But I know we've got someone asking that, in the case of existing R410A systems, which will be in place, what were the key issues in terms of that awareness regarding low GWP sort of dropping refrigerant replacement?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's a 2L, I would say you don't drop it in. The problem with trying to swap from an A1 to an A2L in existing equipment is, well, you've got issues with PED. If it was a Cat 1 or a Cat 2, it will go to, it'll go up a PED category, and a lot of the equipment won't be, suitable for that. There's overall gas charges. There is a mildly flammable with the 2Ls. They have this flammability issue, so you don't know if you're going to potentially leak more refrigerant into a space than it's allowed within the regulations. And then also the equipment itself will have been designed for a totally an A1 style refrigerant. So there'll be compartments in there. There may be sparking components in areas that weren't previously sort of defined. So I would say, in terms of dropping in from an A1 to a 2L, you really just don't consider it at all. If there are on the market people looking at sort of lower GWP A1s, there's still a lot to consider in terms of the capacity, the pipe sizing and everything else. You need to do the oils to make sure that's all going to work. But even then, I would say you have to be very careful, because you'll very, very likely go out of the warranty of the equipment. The manufacturer that was previously there will have designed that for the 410A equipment, assuming it is, this could be 410A, it could be 448, 449, it could be anything that you're trying to retrofit. If you're trying to do it with a lower GWP alternative, you do need to check with your manufacturer really and be 100% sure that they're okay with that. And probably most likely they're going to say no, I think would be the truth.
That's great. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the manufacturers there, Chris. I guess going across the panel there, the sense that the role of manufacturers, and I'll move to Brian and then through the panel on this, that's all right. But how is that changing, or how does that need to change in a sense of what role manufacturers are playing, and I guess how they collaborate with the supply chain as well as sort of end users and customers?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to getting clarity around the regulation as a starting point, because unless the end user can kind of see what the options are available to them, and then kind of, because of delay in regulation, the end user then becomes delayed investment. That investment then delays it with the manufacturers, and everybody ends up in this bit of a holding pattern around, in terms of not necessarily what the end user wants, but what can actually be provided to the end user from a manufacturing perspective. And this is where you end up in these kind of unintended consequences scenario that I talk about. So, well, we don't know about one element of the regulation, but we know we can use technology over here, so let's use that, only to then find further down the line that you might have, energy resilience challenges, safety challenges, so on and so forth. In terms of manufacturers having a more broader mindset around technology development, and that's really where you want to be. So where Chris talks about they supply CO2 and A2L technology, which is fantastic because it keeps the options available and keeps it open to the supply chain, so to the end user group, which they then have those options when they're always challenging. So what are the cost options I've got here? Well, organizations like that can then provide them with the information they need. Say, this is the cost of this system, the energy performance, the maintenance performance, the emissions, and looking at the whole thing more holistically. But I'm afraid it does boil back down to clarification in the regulation to make sure that it creates that technical environment where different solutions can be developed.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was going to go to move to Neil to ask you about that sense as well, about manufacturers and kind of the role. I suppose it's part of it will be the relationships here, I guess we're talking about in industry of
Yeah, I think, I mean, as Brian said, you know, nobody makes a business decision unless they've got certainty, and at the moment it's very difficult to have that certainty with so much going on. But equally, you know, the market, you know, the customers of manufacturers also have a big part to play here, because if they're not switching to lower GWP because they can still get hold of the existing refrigerants, then there's no market for that product either. So it's really, you know, as well as, you know, moving to more sustainable refrigerants and making sure your equipment is able to carry on working for, you know, for the lifetime, as Mark said, for lifetime equipment. You know, we could end up in a situation where you have to change the equipment because you can't get the refrigerant, not because the refrigerants, not because the equipment's run out. So it's really important that the market sees that, you know, manufacturers need to see that signal, buying signal, that the market's ready to move and going forward as well. And that will help to give them the certainty as well as the regulation side of it as well. But absolutely, I mean, you know, you wouldn't make a decision unless you were sure what was going on, or unless you see that the market is chosen to go a certain direction. And at the moment, everyone's just kind of waiting and see. You know, when we get to the next phase down step, hopefully that will be, you know, that will be enough for squeeze to see people more go to the lower GWP options. And then that will, you know, hopefully get the ball rolling, and we'll be on that road then to going down that path. But as it is at the moment, you know, everyone has to make a decision. Everyone has to interpret what they see in front of them and make a decision based on that. And at the moment, that's the answer should be, I need to be installing low GWP options now.
Chris, if it's all right to...
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was going to add about one thing, you know, something that end users, because I echo everything that's just been said by Neil and Brian there, but I think another thing that end users can do and contractors can do is really do some trials. Do you know what I mean? If you've not trialed a system, you know, work with a manufacturer and do some trials on A2Ls, get yourself confident in using them, because, you know, it may be that you're at the moment, purely from a cost point of view, you know, and I understand the market, it becomes quite difficult, you know, because you're competing with other contractors and everything else. But get yourself ready, do some trials, because then you'll have the lead at the point when these things, you know, the change is definitely going to happen. So you need to, you know, you can work with your customers, your end users, and have something, a ready solution that you know that you're comfortable with, that all your contractors or your employees are comfortable with doing. A big thing I would say right now is really, if you've not trialed or done a trial, you really want to start doing some trials on A2L type equipment or any GWP alternative.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, because we've had some questions as well about longer term planning in a sense, and the CapEx sort of elements here. You know, there'll be people who'll be putting together large projects or starting to feel they need to replace systems in the next few years. And I know it's been raised by some of the audience about sort of putting information out there in a sense. Do we have those references? Do we start to have the information in places people can go to in a sense? I guess, Mark, I start with you and then move through the panel like that. But in terms of the beginnings of CapEx planning and people maybe in that there, you know, where can the information be, or what more can we do, I guess, to put the information out there so people can start to inform themselves?
Well, I think one of the obviously areas, as I would say, was you know, obviously through the trade association, you know, the stuff on our websites. We're going to be doing more, you know, newsletters regarding the issues that are facing us. You know, it's a rapidly changing regulatory environment. So, you know, this is today's RAC question time is just a snapshot of where we are today. You can see there's a lot of unanswered questions. So we're going to try and keep that information flow going as things change, and obviously the implications that has for industry. But we've already published quite a bit of stuff around, you know, the use of A2L refrigerants, for instance. In the past, there's been guidance around CO2. There's been guidance around, the use of highly flammables like propane. So, there's actually quite a lot of information out there already. I think the key thing is for people to go and, do their research, and ask questions like today. There's going to be more of these forums for doing it, but there's no real better way than actually getting involved with your trade association. I can't emphasize that too much, because you'll be right. I mean, we don't expect people who join to be givers necessarily in every case. There's a lot of people I would call, as receivers, that in the sense that they get the information, that's hot off the presses, because we're doing the conversations directly with DEFRA, for instance. So, get involved.
Brilliant. I mean, the time always sort of creeps up on us with these things, and she said we'll be raising many more questions. We can't get to all of them on there, but I am going to just prep the panel a little bit. I'm going to do the annoying summary of how can we take something complex and what can we do next, or what their main message, I guess, would be to the audience, to government, to Mark and the other experts as well, in a sense. So I'll finish on Mark there, but I'll go Brian, to yourself, if I could ask you perhaps for a summary, right, of where we are from in the next few months ahead when we look for this certainty. What is the message? What do we need to take out of this, would you say?
I think mine kind of links back into both Mark and Chris's comment. I mean, trial not error has been something that's been important to me for a long time, and it's no difference. You got to know the facts and figures, know the numbers. So I think kind of my last thoughts around it is that we do need to stop playing fairground games with technology. We're going to fix one thing to create three more problems with its ozone depleting GWP. We need to be professionals and provide that professional input where it's needed. And ultimately independent review, to answer your previous question, is very important. What type of technology do I use? Well, select yourself somebody that can provide you an independent review, because these are big investments. And then probably just my final thought is that the risks remain the same. So energy resilience, safety and training are still the same risks as we've had for many, many years.
So it's just the update of that, but the engineering challenges, I guess, Brian. Neil, if I could come to you in your sense there of
so I think, yeah, as I said earlier, I mean, don't delay. Get on with it. These things are going on. I understand there's a lot of uncertainty out there with many things which are going on, but these things are coming, and you have to make a decision, and you can't just delay and wait and see what happens. So make a decision, and most importantly is when you're looking at what refrigerant to use the most appropriate refrigerant for the application. We tend to pigeonhole a lot of refrigerants. They're all refrigerants. Some will be better for other applications than others. Use the best refrigerant for the application, which is also sustainable in the long term. And just make that decision and go with it, and start using those refrigerants now. It put you in a really good position going in the future, and you won't end up in the problems that many other people will, who are just burying their heads in the sand at the moment and hoping it will go away.
There's that trailing sense, somewhat, in the sense of where you are. Chris, I guess that moves. I know you were talking.
Yeah. I mean, I echo again. I think the thing is that you need to contact the consultancies. You know what I mean? You need to start now because it's coming fast. So talk to consultancies, talk to training agencies, talk to manufacturers, talk to your trade association. There's loads of information out there now on different options. I would say that the biggest thing is to really make a start, and even if it is dipping your toe in the water in terms of doing a trial, it's still a start. So because it's going to come pretty quickly now. Whatever phase down comes, it's going to be pretty fast over the next couple of years.
But it does seem to be from all of you, in a sense that, in a way, as kind of the challenges that the new regulations will pose, certainty seems to be that there will actually be some regulation. Does seem to be that industry is looking for that, which is when we talk about opportunities, or it's not all doom and gloom, that perhaps industry will be able to to understand better when we have those regulations. I guess that leads into last but not least, Mark, there from both your Comores hat and your trade hat, where you sort of see to tie us up there.
Yeah, I think the responsible use of F-gases is what really the whole thing was about. They were invented, they were put together to fulfill a purpose, and they they did that. Efficient, products, low toxicity, relatively inexpensive. So unfortunately, there were consequences of that, and much of that due to the way that they were used, not the specific products themselves. If they're kept within the equipment, they do no harm. And there's now big reclamation programs, so we can actually recycle and have a circular economy with these products. So if you like, all of the things are in place now to be able to responsibly use F-gases. So it does mean that there is room for F-gases going forward. Now, we want to limit the amount that are placed on the market there, which means, keep the existing ones in the systems, but have enough available to service what's existing out there, so we don't scrap a lot of existing equipment, which would be a complete and utter waste. But I think F-gases do have, a future there. Okay, it's going to look different to what it does today, but I think they're not dead yet, and I think there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge from both a GB F-gas perspective and also a PFAS perspective, which is a much longer thing. And Ray talk about the P word. Ray talked about derogations. When you've got essential use, when you've got products that are critical to your applications, like for instance heat pumps, getting efficient heat pumps, you can get derogations that can be much longer and give you a lot more time for transition, which does give you some levels of certainty. So obviously all of that's in the mix, but it only comes from making our voices heard and keeping campaigning and lobbying and consulting, if you like, as we move forward. So we ask everybody's help with that. We're all in it together, and we need to push on. And we appreciate everybody's viewing today. And if there's questions that weren't able to be answered today, then obviously through the forum of RAC magazine, we hope to be able to get back to them at some point.
Brilliant. Yes, and just to say, we've had a few questions there, but we'll be we're trying to put some together. I know we'll be speaking with the presentations we've had about getting that together for some of the online coverage that will be appearing on RAC Online, and obviously there'll be a lot of in-depth coverage in our next issue about this there to follow up on. So yes, as Mark said, do follow us up on that there. But in the meantime, I just wanted to thank all the panel again. So I want to thank Chris, Neil, Brian, and Mark. Now these things tend to go, so there's plenty more questions we could touch on, but really appreciate all of your time today to come and join us and try and get our heads around the changes that are coming as we go there. But in the meantime, do remember I said to keep an eye on racplus.com and RAC magazine for more in-depth coverage of the event. We also just wanted to highlight that we are still looking at entries for this year's Cooling Awards as well, which will be tied to some of these issues about prepping and good practice with the transition through F-gas and the regulations ahead. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us once again, and to the panels we've had. And we look forward to following up certainly on this as we go forward. But have a good afternoon, and thank you all for your time.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.